There is no quicker way to make yourself think about the possibilities of gods and afterlives than thinking about death. And it is no coincidence that discussions about assisted suicide almost always undertake the spiritual ramifications rather than the suffering or well-being of the person involved. I am going to argue that the death with dignity option is one that is almost impossible to morally oppose. But for now, I ask that we keep the discussion to the well-being of the person forced to consider that choice. Personal attacks against those who are already suffering is something that I am offended by. And as you know, I am not easily offended. I do not know Dan Diaz, nor did I know his wife Brittany Maynard. But we all know their story, and we all have an opinion. It appears that assisted suicide is a very hard discussion to have where we agree to disagree. And regardless of your opinion, we should all be embarrassed by how some have responded. I've never had to contemplate this issue personally. I've never lost someone close to me too soon. I have no idea what it is like, and I have no idea what to say to Dan other than the cliche, at least she didn't suffer. But I do know that it would undoubtedly be one of the most painful things a man can go through. And to have to read these comments, to think of Brittany hearing the things said about her, I'm sure some of it got through. Now, I am not going to be so bold as to assume another person's intentions, but I would guess that this vial was a product of people fearing their own mortality. Nothing brings out the venom and the fear of God than the fear of death. I have another story I want to bring up before I propose my argument. This is Nina Poeta, a 17-year-old cheerleader from Connecticut. She was a cheerleader who was diagnosed with brain cancer, and the reason you may not have heard about her, unlike Brittany, is that she made the choice to fight it till the bitter end. She unfortunately lost the fight and passed away on November 1st, 2014, the very same day that Brittany ended her life. They both died on the same day, and of the same cause, brain cancer. But I would bet there are many who have never heard the name Nina Poeta before, and that is because her death was not a great headline. The stories of the courageous battles against cancer don't generate the same kind of debate that assisted suicide does. And news outlets and social media use debate and controversy like a fuel. But should choosing to fight be considered the better choice by default? Now, I want to be clear that what I'm about to say is only my opinion on what I would want and choose if I were in this situation. It is in no way intended to imply what I think others should do. This is not what I think Brittany or Nina should have done. It is simply what I think about when I put myself in their situations. It is hard not to be moved by the bravery shown by Nina, but it is also hard to look at what she had to go through. I know for myself, if I was given a short time to live and was informed that it would be very hard on myself to go through it, I would still choose to live as long as possible. I am terrified of death, absolutely petrified of it, and I would cling on to this life no matter how unbecoming for as long as possible. I know my pride, however, and I know that I would not want the last memories for my family to be me gradually wasting away. I know that the treatment would be very expensive and have a hard toll on my family during my final days and long after. I would wish that I could be as brave as Brittany was and die with dignity. I also know that Nina's family is still and always will be grateful for her choosing to fight, even knowing she had no chance. Whatever the cost was, they would do it again without even a thought about it. They cherish every second they got to spend with her and thank her every day for being brave enough to suffer through as long as she could, give them as many seconds as possible to remember. And I know that Dan is thankful to Brittany for being far braver than I could ever be. I don't know if being scared is an option when faced with certain death. All I know is that they chose one of the only two options one in the situation, and they both showed more courage than I believe I have within myself. And I think the crux of the argument is one missed by many of the anti-death with dignity side. Neither one of these poor women were given the choice to live. I'm sure that I can assume another's intentions and say that if they were given the choices of A, die now relatively painlessly, B, die later after going through quite a bit of pain, or C, don't die at all, both would have chosen C before you could finish asking the question. Calling it suicide is completely off base by a wide margin. Saying things like suicide is not the answer may make yourself feel more moral, but in this situation, saying something like this is beyond the protection of a computer screen. Knowing how much it could hurt her loved ones if they read is the most cowardly thing I can imagine. And the idea that life is for God to make and God to take, and the other arguments like it, are so asinine that I was inclined to make this video. Because I believe that most who are against don't understand the difference between someone choosing to die and someone who chose how they wanted to die. Let's look at two hypothetical examples. In example 1, we have the Hitler dilemma, where Hitler killed himself to escape being captured by the Russians. Example 2 is a man who has committed himself to performing a mass shooting and then shooting himself before the cops can arrest him. What is the fundamental difference between these two examples? Why is one true suicide whereas the other is not? The difference is choice. In the Hitler dilemma, he does not have the option to remain alive. There is no Hitler gets to live card he can play. If Hitler was captured by a country filled with devout pacifists, they would still have killed him, and he was about to be captured by the Russians. His options were die now relatively painlessly, or die in 6 months, and it's going to hurt the entire time you're dying. Our mass shooter example, however, completely has the option to remain alive. When he wakes up the morning on the day of the crime, he can choose not to do it. When he loads his gun, when he gets into the car, as he is driving to the scene of the crime, as he aims his gun at the first victim, up until he pulls the trigger and commits to his suicide, he can decide he wants to live and simply drive away. That is the difference between those who kill themselves because they don't want to live anymore and those who choose to die with dignity. One has the choice to live and the other doesn't. Now, if you are like me, using the Hitler dilemma to describe the situation of Brittany and Nina leaves a sour taste in your mouth. So to better illustrate my point, let us do a thought experiment. For this experiment, we need to assume that when a person dies, their next of kin receives an email explaining that they are dead and how they died. Far-fetched, I know, but it will make sense as the experiment goes along. You are a young girl named Kayla, and you have just been kidnapped by a crazy gang called the Wackazoos. All that is known about the Wackazoos is that not a single member of their gang has ever been caught, and not a single victim of theirs has ever been rescued. They have a 100% kill rate. The police have even stopped trying to recover their victims since it appears to be all but impossible. You also know that they kill every single victim they kidnap, but not before horrifyingly torturing and raping their victim for 1 year. Their victims are tortured and raped in the most painful and grotesque fashion one can imagine. Around the clock, continuously, until being executed in the most painful way one can imagine on the 1-year anniversary of their capture. Sitting in the back of a van, knowing what is going to happen to you, and knowing that your family knows you have been captured by the Wackazoos, you pull a cyanide pill out of your pocket. Would you consider swallowing the tablet as suicide? An act that will make an all-powerful and loving God condemn you to an eternal hell and suffering? And even if you did, knowing that your father will receive an email alerting him that you have died somewhat peacefully by cyanide, isn't swallowing the pill almost mandatory? Imagine being a father knowing that your daughter has been captured by a gang that is currently performing the above-described acts on her, waking up in the middle of the night by nightmares of your daughter being abused and raped and tortured in the most painful way you can imagine, while also realizing that these acts are more than likely happening at that very moment. And there is nothing you can do about it. If instead you received an email alerting that your daughter had died without pain by cyanide, I don't know what it is like to lose a child. I don't want to know. No one does, and I don't wish that knowledge on a single person. And I can promise you this, Nina's parents didn't want to lose their daughter, and Brittany's husband didn't want to lose his wife, and neither one of them wanted to die. But when the doctors came back with their diagnosis, I can't even imagine what it is to have the color removed from your sight. Just like I can only imagine what it is like being little Kayla in the back of the Wackazoo's van looking at my cyanide pill. I know that I don't want to die, but that choice has been taken from me. I know my family will be crushed by my death, but they will be far better off knowing that I didn't go through unnecessary pain. I know that my father will be able to be honestly comforted by the old cliche, at least she didn't suffer. And if I was a judge or a politician that voted for a death with dignity initiative, and I was talking to the father of a woman who was unfortunate in having to use this option, I could say with all honesty, I'm sorry for your loss, but at least she didn't suffer. But if this option was not available because I had voted against death with dignity, all I could say, if I was being honest, is she did suffer greatly. But at least she didn't anger the invisible sky parent.